It would be hard to describe how much I enjoyed writing this book and how grateful I am to you as a congregation for gifting me with a study leave a year ago now. Since I get to be the first to record a video about the book, I thought I might begin with the backstory, how the idea for the book came about and developed. Some people have asked about that. It also allows me to thank one person in our church in particular. So, as with all writing projects, there were a lot of aha moments. 10 years ago, I was reading about the 7 last words of the Christ, and I had a thought. If you don't know, the 7 last words aren't words per se, but sayings Jesus said on the cross. Things like, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, or it is finished. Well, anyway, I suddenly wondered what the 7 first words would be. So I started even back then playing with the idea of naming things Jesus either said early in the Gospels or that rose to levels of prominence. More recently, Phil and Patty Love, longtime members of our congregation, got involved in the Life Worth Living curriculum at Yale Divinity School, where Phil had worked for a few years. They helped endow something similar at William Jewell here in the Kansas City area. They also graciously paid for me to attend a week-long forum on the topic at Pepperdine University. The idea was to help folks wrestle with what makes for a life worth living, and to do so without a particular religious focus. So shortly thereafter, our church hosted a virtual conversation with Miroslav Volf from Yale and David Brooks from the New York Times on the topic, followed by me offering that course numerous times. While I loved offering that philosophical approach, I still kept thinking in the back of my mind about a Jesus version, what he might say the good life looks like. And you can see how the 7 first words in that course sort of came together. Then, as I describe in the first pages of the book, my wife Carol and I went to visit Phil and Patty down in Florida, where Phil was dying. I knew he would want me to read to him, so I decided on a very early draft of this book, nothing quite like the introduction you read. It was after reading to Phil, sitting on the deck with Carol and Patty, that I realized how this book would begin and to whom it would be dedicated. So my last thank you goes out to Patty Love and in memory of Phil. Let me then move to talking briefly about the introduction and first chapter. As you will have read, the book has a twofold thesis. Jesus wasn't born just to die, and neither were we. The second part is fairly obvious. You didn't come into this world just to die, even if that's inevitable. You and I were born to live. But while that's obvious when it comes to us, for several reasons, some pockets of Christianity have assumed Jesus came for the main purpose of dying. I won't go into the details that I do in some of the footnotes, except to say Christianity still tends to talk more of Jesus' death than his life, and I give all kinds of examples there that you might discuss. One of the Bible verses I deal with in the intro is John 3:16, which shows up most years behind home plate at the World Series. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have eternal life. As I note in some detail, while the verse can be read as referring to Jesus' death, there are other ways to read it. The verb gave, for example, has nothing to do with death. And eternal life isn't a quantity of years, but a quality of life. In other words, what if Jesus died for the way he lived, caring for the poor and challenging the Roman Empire? And what if he can teach us how to live before we die? That's the basic focus of the intro. Lots there to talk about. Chapter 1 focuses on a saying found early in several of the Gospels when Jesus says, "Come, follow me." Traditionally, the church has called that discipleship, which is a good church word. It refers to being a student of another person, or better yet, being apprenticed to another. Think of a classically trained cellist getting to learn from Yo-Yo Ma. It's about more than techniques. It's about taking on a way of life. I quote my mentor, Fred Craddock, who summed it up best with this line: "Come just as you are, but don't expect to stay that way." The Gospels make it clear Jesus welcomed a ragtag band of followers, but he called them to grow and become their best selves. One of my favorite lines in that chapter comes from the Hasidic rabbi Zusha. On his deathbed, he was crying, and his students tried to comfort him. They thought he was worried that he hadn't lived up to the standards of Abraham or Moses. but he said that he didn't fear being asked by the Holy One why he hadn't lived like Moses, rather, why he hadn't lived like Zuzia. As I note in the book, Jesus' expectation of folks are not one size fits all, not even close. To a rich man in Luke's gospel, he says to sell everything and follow him. But a couple pages later, a rich man gives away half his possessions, and that's enough. And there are other examples, which turns out to be a good segue for your group to wrestle with. I have a few suggestions, mostly from the book's own questions, and as far as I'm concerned, the group can always make up their own questions. But here are some suggestions. Number 1, if you had coffee with Jesus once a week for several months, what do you think would be your biggest takeaway? What would he be passionate about? Can you imagine describing him to your friends? The introduction begins with a quote. There is more that is important about Jesus than his death. So question number 2, in your own spiritual journey, how did the death of Jesus get treated in comparison to the life he lived? Chapter 1 also begins with a quote, this one from Parker Palmer. The life I am living is not the same as the life that wants to live in me. So question number 3, what does that say to you about being apprenticed to Jesus? Along with your own reflections on the readings, that should be enough to keep you busy. I hope it's a rich conversation because being alive is a rich thing itself. In fact, a good friend of some of us who moved out of state last year recently had open heart surgery. After emerging from the fog of anesthesia, he declared aloud, "It's good to be alive." That's the truth. Enjoy your time together.